Okay, so how did everyone go? I should say too that I accidentally cut you guys off there at the end of that conversation. I pressed stopped on the both the recording and also the connection. So sorry about that, but I'll try and make sure that this runs through until the end of our 30 minutes. So how did everyone go with the quantitative and qualitative data? Do you have any questions? Okay, good question. All right, so Matt's just asked the question, things like colours, would that be categorised as quantitative data or qualitative data? Um, it all depends if you are looking at counting the number of colours or if you're looking at categorising things per colour. If I talk about things like categorising colours, I would call that qualitative because, first of all, people's perception of colour is different, but also colours can not be averaged. You cannot say you've got half a colour or a quarter of a colour, but also colours can be more nominal forms of data or categorical forms of data. So you could divide you could put all the males into well, you could categorize all the males into the color blue or females into the color pink. Um, so that one. It really does depend on how you take a look at it, but I would go more qualitative, particularly when you're looking at those different categories, and also because the perception and idea of different color changes from person to person. It's not static or it's not objective. It's more of a subjective element. Any other questions? Oh, okay. Yep. 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 Okay. Average handling time. Yep. Yep. Okay. Okay. Yep. All right. So Lisa's just asked if things like Lisa's previously worked in a call center, and she mentioned that one of the things they take a look at call centers is how you speak on the phone with customers and your average handling time. Um, she wanted to know whether she should classify that as qualitative or quantitative. And I think my answer to you, Lisa, would be I classify it as both. And for the reason being is that it both contains elements of quantitative and qualitative data. So you mentioned you get monitored on your average handling time. Definitely the average handling time would be a source of quantitative data. And it would be quantitative because they're taking a look at the average figure, and they probably want to compare your average figures against other staff members who work in the team in order to bring down the overall call hold time and talk time to make things more efficient in that call centre. You also mentioned that your calls are listened to and you get feedback about the calls themselves, if they're good, if they need to be improved on. And that type of feedback would usually be qualitative feedback. However, I have actually come across call centres that have specific checklists, and they're taking a look at things that you either do or don't do on the phone. And in that particular instance, those checklists, if they're closed response checklists, would usually be quantitative. So it really does vary how you're actually looking at the data and using that data. Okay, so I am aware of the time, so we do need to continue on with the session. Hopefully that's been helpful there with finding out those differences between the two forms of data that you receive. So the next part of the session is taking a look at why are data and information collected. Now, I think we have touched upon that a little bit. So just to give you some examples of different data and information that businesses collect. Now, for some of the organisations that I've worked for, now one of the earliest organisations that I worked for was Kmart. I worked at Kmart 15 years ago. That was one of my first jobs. And I was working as a checkout chick, so to speak. I also worked a little bit there in audio visual, and I worked in stock too. It was a really good opportunity for me to develop my skills and gain access to the workforce, because it's really difficult to get a job if you don't have experience, which is a shame, because a lot of businesses, and I try and encourage some of my friends who are business owners to bring on staff and train them up from scratch, because it will be rewarding, and most likely the staff will stay with the organisation because they value that training. So things like what they took a look at when I was working there is I would clock in. So for every shift I would clock in and then I would clock out. And that would indicate to the payroll staff, first of all, did I go to work or did I not go to work? Shall they tick me off? Should they pay me? But also it indicated that I didn't just clock into work and walk off, or clock into work and go home, or go on a 4-hour lunch break, because the shifts were usually 4 hours. I did clock off too, and that indicated the start time and the end time. It indicated the time I was at work, a form of quantitative data, and that information was then cross-referenced before they paid me to ensure that staff were paid correctly and fairly. Another place that this was done was out the back in stock control. I would unbox cartons, I would take them out, and the number of cartons that I had would be written down, would be tallied, and that was a form of productivity to ensure that staff were basically doing their jobs, doing their part. They weren't offloading work, they were responsible for the different boxes that they had, and also it ensured that productive staff were identified and unproductive staff were identified too, so they could put them on track to be more efficient with what they were doing. So why are data and information collected? I suppose at the end of the day, data and information give business owners, give managers and supervisors, give people in the community information about things that are most relevant to them. So in a business sense, data is collected to make the business more efficient, productive, to indicate, to monitor, to see how things are going. Are they going backwards? Are they going forwards? Another reason why information data is collected too is for legal reasons. For example, RTOs, training organisations, need to collect data to demonstrate that they are doing things correctly and that they are teaching their learners in an appropriate manner in line with the different unit outlines posted on the training.gov website. So there's some reasons there. Different ways to collect data, I think we've touched upon that. Different ways to collect data are things like you can collect data by conducting surveys. You can collect data by asking questions. You can have things like observational data. You could have the data based on emails that you've received. For example, you could take a look at complaints, the different complaints you've received and whether they've been overcome. You could collect that data and you could tabulate it in an effort to improve your customer satisfaction. Jumping onto validity and reliability now. Now, validity and reliability, I'm not too sure if you've heard of these terms before, but they basically indicate that, well, validity takes a look at the truthfulness of the measure. It basically confirms that what you are collecting is what you're aiming to measure or identify or monitor. So the whole purpose of collecting the data is related to the actual data itself. So if I wanted to find data that indicated how comfortable men's shoes were, I would need to actually, first of all, speak to men, not speak to women, because women typically wear women's shoes. Typically, I would speak to men about how comfortable the shoes were, and I would also make sure that they had worn those shoes. That ensures that I'm actually measuring their perspectives of wearing those shoes. Another example too would be things like reliability of measures. You want to make sure that the data you're collecting you're being logical and you're being systematic about it, but also you want to be sure that you're following the correct procedures on a continuous basis. You're not going outside the square or outside the rules that you've set for collecting that data. You are being consistent, and therefore if you're being consistent, then the data should be similar each time you collect it. So that's that reliability and validity of data. I think at your stage, I think that you really need to take a look at what is the purpose that I'm collecting this data? How am I going to use it? Is it logical? Is it systematic? Okay, so just taking a look at the time, we are edging towards the end of this introductory course, but one of the most common ways that businesses analyze and collect data would be using Excel. So I'll show you what Excel looks like. If you haven't used Excel in the past, it's worthwhile having a play around with it. So Excel is a Microsoft program, and typically it can be used to organize data across rows and columns. So I'll just open up this Excel and show you. You can also do things like graphs and bar charts in Excel, which we won't do now. We'll talk a little bit about that in session 2. So I'll just open up a blank workbook. Okay, so with this workbook, right, one of the easiest things with Microsoft Excel is that you can organize the data systematically and logically. You can also export that data, and the data is usually exportable across different programs and even databases. So a lot of the databases allow you to export data in Excel format, which is really easy. So if you want to get data from a database, you can export it. And sometimes if you're involved in programming databases or transferring information across databases, you can also import information from Excel files on your desktop into the databases themselves. Now, depending on what version of Excel you've got will depend on the layout at the top. Now, I'm currently using the Excel for Mac. It's very similar to Microsoft. Some of the buttons might be different, but your forms of control are at the very top. Usually, if you're starting off, you'd want to start off on the Home tab. Make sure that that's clicked. Make sure that's clicked, I should say. That way your Excel will be clean and obvious across the screen. So right here, I'm selecting that. I'm just putting my mouse over the number 1 and selecting that. That is called a row. Now we have several rows. Row number 3, row number 4. You can scroll down if you want. You can go to row number 426. Those rows and those letters at the top, see that there? That's column B. This is a column as well, another column, column G, column F, column D. Those rows and columns make it easy for you to identify the location of your data. So say for instance, if I input some data here, hung up, so the caller hung up during the conversation. The position there of that data is kind of like a coordinate. So that is column J, row 10. Or you could call it J10. Every single cell, and this is a cell by the way, every single cell in Microsoft Excel has a coordinate, and that is incredibly helpful because if you have rows and rows of data or columns and columns of data and you want to communicate with someone by email or telephone to bring their attention to some data, maybe you identify some data that was incorrect or it looked a little bit odd, it was a bit of an outlier there in the data you had collected, you can tell them the exact position of that data and they can go to it. It makes things a lot easier. It ensures that communication is easier too. It also enables you to use things like formulas in the Excel document, which we'll talk about in session 2 briefly. And those formulas are really helpful around this section here, the insert function auto sum section. That's the main formulas which you'll typically use working in an organisation. So that's Microsoft Excel. We'll take a look at that in session 2. Alright, so just get out of that. We've talked about being logical with data. Now, the biggest thing with data is useless unless it is legitimate, it is valid, it is reliable. You want your data to be correct. Data tells a story. Now, sometimes people can interpret those stories and sometimes people can't. But there is always a meaning to data, no matter how it is collected, no matter what type of data it is. So before you forward it on, you need to be sure that you have done everything possible to make sure that is correct. So how do I do that? How do I make sure data is correct? Because sometimes data is just spat out by systems. Sometimes I don't physically collect the data, I'm given the data. So how do I check that that data is correct? Well, probably the biggest thing to do is to take a look at the purpose of the data. So that is, what's the reason it's being collected for? And the next thing to take a look at, what is going to happen with that data when you forward it on? If you find out those two things, you'll be able to find out or take a look and identify areas of that data that may not be correct. So that is there missing data? If you've organised your data from lowest to highest, if you've ranked your data, you can identify outliers in the data or missing data and determine why that data was not provided. Sometimes people might accidentally delete rows of data or columns of data. Now those rows and columns could affect the total or could affect the average at the bottom of the data, assuming that we're playing with quantitative data. Now you can check that using the formulas in Excel before you forward that on. So doing everything possible to ensure that that data is legit before you forward it on is quite important, because usually the person who wants the data is going to do something with it, and the decisions that they make or decisions that people make up the ladder in business can be affected by the data that you've provided. So definitely make sure it's correct. Do everything possible to do that. Okay, so this brings us to the end of the session. It was a short session. I've had fun talking with you guys. You guys have been really interactive with me as well. You've asked plenty of questions. I will be back in a couple of hours' time. We do have a session booked this evening. Actually, no, you've got a session booked at 2 o'clock. Okay, so 2 o'clock, I'll be back. Have a break, and we'll take a look at the session 2 plan for the data course that you're doing now. All right. Brief summary. So today we've taken a look at what is data, the different sources of data. We're taking a look at how data is collected, the appropriate ways of collecting data, and assessing the validity and reliability of it. We've taken a look at Microsoft Excel, which is the common program that is used with data. And we've also taken a look at the importance of being logical with data and confirming its legitimacy. So we've covered quite a lot. So thank you very much. I'll see you guys at 2 o'clock.